Hello, this is John Bawden, historian at Oregon State University, and in this lecture, we will review the globalization of beer. Beer is big business. Molson Coors, the world's third largest brewing enterprise, is headquartered in Chicago and represents the merger between Canada's largest brewery and two of the biggest in the United States. In this lecture, I won't mention Molson Coors again, but I will discuss what it represents, the spread of light lager beers across the globe, and the consolidation of corporate brewing on a global scale in the 21st century. But let's back up a bit first. The Netherlands is a country in Northern Europe with a long brewing tradition, and it's a country that played an important role in the globalization of beer. Heineken Breweries is a Dutch multinational brewing company founded in 1864 that became the first international powerhouse of beer. It's the biggest brewer in Europe with its distinctive green bottles and logo. Heineken Lager is available in more countries than any other beer. It has been said that Heineken taught the world to drink pale lager. Gerard Heineken transitioned to brewing with lager yeast at a time when it was not well established and required significant capital and brewing expertise. From the beginning, Heineken and his successors were risk takers. In 1889, the brewery won the Grand Prix at the International Exhibition in Paris, which helped boost its international reputation. When Gerard's son, Henry Pierre, took over the business, he modernized Heineken's brewing facilities and established the company's first overseas export depot in Suriname. Heineken was poised to make a series of daring moves. During the 1930s, Heineken introduced beer to countries that had no locally brewed beer, and the beer they made was a light, refreshing pale lager. Wherever there was a local brewery, Heineken's strategy was to invest in the local brand to grow a domestic market and then introduce Heineken as the new premium lager that would be regarded as the better beer choice for those who could afford it. One innovative feature of Heineken at this time was its global outlook and its early promotion of beer in Asia and Africa. Heineken built brewing facilities overseas where other brewers merely exported bottles. In 1932, Heineken began producing Tiger beer, which went on to become the best-selling beer in Southeast Asia. Soon afterwards, Heineken acquired a brewery in Surabaya, Indonesia, and started to brew a beer there called Bintang. Today, Bintang is so popular that it has effectively become the Indonesian word for beer. No other brewery was doing anything like this at the time. In the past, breweries grew by exporting their beer. After World War II, Africa became a focus of Heineken. It built a brewery in Nigeria and produced Star Lager, which soon became the most popular brand in the region. Back in Europe, Heineken merged with its longtime rival Amstel in 1968 and took over Amstel brewing operations in Jordan, Lebanon, Greece, Madagascar, Suriname, and Curacao. After 1968, Heineken built breweries in England, Sierra Leone, Trinidad, Jamaica, Norway, Sweden, Tahiti, Ireland, Italy, France, Morocco, South Korea, Japan, China, Spain, Vietnam, Bulgaria, Switzerland, Poland, and Slovakia. You get the idea. One remarkable part of Heineken's business success has been its focus on established beer markets. In April 1933, Heineken's manager of global sales brought a cargo of Heineken beer to the United States just days before Prohibition ended. Heineken was not only the first legally imported beer in the United States, but its team back in Amsterdam saw the potential of the beer market. Heineken was exported to the United Kingdom as early as the 1880s, but even as late as the 1950s, British beer drinkers were still reluctant to embrace lager. But Heineken persisted. It took part in successful mergers in the UK and took over the operation of some 3,000 British pubs where, you guessed it, Heineken lager was on tap. Heineken taught the world to drink pale lager. Who exports the most beer worldwide? Is it Germany? Is it the Netherlands or China or the United States? No, it's Mexico. Mexico is both a major consumer of beer and the largest exporter of beer in the world, thanks to its bevy of popular brands, including Corona, Dos Equis, Modelo, and Pacifico, and its free access to the massive American beer market. Long before Europeans came to Mexico in the 16th century, people living in Mesoamerica enjoyed a drink called pulque made from the sap of the maguey plant. The alcoholic content of the drink is very similar to beer. And from the 16th century onward, pulque was widely consumed by Mexico's lower classes, while wine remained the drink of choice for the wealthy. In the 1860s, Mexico was embroiled in a civil war over the structure of government, monarchy versus liberal republic, and at this time, Mexican conservatives had convinced a European prince, Maximilian I, from the Habsburg royal family to come sit on a throne in Mexico City and rule the country as an emperor. To Mexico, Maximilian brought his own European court brewer of Viennese lagers. Unfortunately for Maximilian, he was executed by firing squad and liberals assumed control of the government. Moving forward, Mexico underwent a rapid process of economic modernization in the 1880s and 1890s. During the economic boom, German immigrants came to Mexico and established regional breweries alongside their native partners. And thanks to artificial refrigeration, a growing number of Mexicans developed a taste for cold lager beer and soft drinks such as Coke. Cuauhtémoc Brewery, founded in 1890, was for a long time the largest brewery in Mexico. And as was the case in the United States, consolidation occurred. Today, 90% of Mexican beers are owned by either Cuauhtémoc or Grupo Modelo. Grupo Modelo was founded by a merger of two Mexican breweries in 1925, and it includes flagship brands Corona, Modelo, and Pacifico. The Modelo Group consolidated in the 20th century and bought many regional breweries. Mexican beers are American lagers made with corn adjuncts. They're light, filtered, crisp, and refreshing, and respected. Now, this is as good as a time as any to say that most countries put their national stamp on light lager. In Germany, fruit and soda is mixed with beer. It's called a radler or a shandy in the United States. In Ireland, the black and tan is commonplace, which is a mix of stout with lager. In South Korea, it's called somek or soju, a rice liquor mixed with lager or mekju. But back to Mexico. The michelada is a Mexican drink that mixes 1 pint of lager beer with tomato juice, fresh lime juice, and hot sauce. It's a culturally distinctive way that Mexicans consume beer based on domestic flavors and preferences. Lime also greatly helped the marketing of Mexican beer brands. Many Mexican beers are served with a lime on the top of the glass bottle, which gave these beers a USP, or a unique selling proposition. Okay, let's go to Asia. Like the ancient Mexicans, the Japanese had long brewed sake, a rice wine, as well as other alcoholic ferments, if not beer. The history of beer and brewing in Japan began in the 18th century when Dutch traders introduced beer. By 1810, the Japanese word and character biru could be found in a Dutch to Japanese dictionary. But Japan was a closed country with very limited outside influence. Well, that all changed in 1854. The United States Navy arrived in Tokyo Bay and demanded access to Japanese ports. The two nations would go on to sign an unequal treaty, unequal for Japan, and the Japanese aristocracy roiled over how to meet the challenge of powerful Western nations demanding trade. In 1868, Japan's Emperor Meiji declared the goal of modernization along Western lines, which meant industrialization and the construction of a powerful naval fleet. As for beer, the quintessential drink of the Northern European nations, there was discussion about its merits. Some Japanese praised beer, but at least one critic described it as, quote, bitter horse piss wine. Ultimately, the Japanese pursued domestic production of the malted drink. Sibei Nakagawa was a former samurai, the mounted warrior class of feudal Japan. In the Meiji era, he traveled to Germany in the late 19th century to learn about brewing techniques and brought this knowledge back to Japan. He became the official brewer on Hokkaido, the large island to the north of Japan's main island, Honshu. And because he was considered the country's brewing expert, he was employed by the government to participate in its industrialization plans. Over time, what would be called the Sapporo Brewery improved its product, and the owners began to grow their own hops and barley on the island itself. Other important breweries followed, such as Kirin. In 1892, the Osaka Brewing Company, Japan's second largest city, launched a new beer called Rising Sun, Asahi. The following year, Asahi won an award at the Chicago World's Fair. Japanese brewing was up and running. Its brewers often used rice as an adjunct and preferred the production of pale lagers over British-inspired ales. 100 years later, Asahi was to become the country's best-selling brand. Asahi Super Dry is a Japanese beer brand released in 1987 that proved highly popular with young drinkers. In a single year, Asahi moved from a 10% market share in Japan's large beer market to over 20% of its market. Asahi Super Dry soon became the most popular beer in Japan. Well, fans of Asahi Super Dry like to say karakuchi, which translates roughly to big body and flavor, which then gives way to a crisp, clean aftertaste that leaves one thirsty for more. Well, beer enthusiasts might disparage dry beer for having little to no flavor, but the brand, it's significant for one, influencing all of Japan's brewers to copy it, and it relates to what was happening in the United States, much like Miller Lite influenced Bud Light. Like America's light beer, Asahi Super Dry is just that, light, dry, and drinkable. The whole world was moving in one direction. Belgium is famous for its fantastic variety of beer styles, including wit beer, sour red ales, and wild yeast beers called lambics. Many of these beers are judged to be among the most fascinating and best tasting beers in the world. But for all this variety, it cannot hide the fact that even in Belgium, 70% of all beer sold is simple, indistinct, uniformly priced lager. Stella Artois is a popular lager in Belgium, and Artois became the country's largest brewer in the late 1920s. Its international pilsners represent about 70% of Belgium's beer market, despite the country's reputation for its distinctive and flavorful ales. And many beer enthusiasts are surprised to find that Pilsner commands this 70% of the beer market. In Belgium, Stella Artois is considered an ordinary beer, despite the premium marketing of it in a country like the United States. One point I want to make about Stella Artois is that its recipe includes maize, just like American lagers in Mexico or the USA. In nearby Germany, the Reinheitsgebot forbids the use of adjuncts, but Belgian brewers have never been subject to such strict brewing regulations. And the lager beers in Belgium have been influenced by North American practices. We live in a global system. But the big story about Artois is its merger with Pied Boeuf and the creation of brewing giant Interbrew in 1987. Remember that name, Interbrew. Having conquered the domestic market in Belgium, Interbrew acquired two well-established companies, Labatt of Canada and Bass Whitbread in the UK. So Interbrew started getting big in the 1990s, and it would go on to take on an unthinkable size in the 21st century. But before we talk about that, let's go to Brazil first. It might come as a surprise to learn that Brazil is the third largest beer producing country in the world. There is an enormous market for beer in Brazil with its 215 million people. This certainly makes it important, but what is less known is about Brazil is the outsized role that its businessmen have played in the global brewing industry's consolidation. As was the case in Mexico and Argentina, Germans began to immigrate in significant numbers to various American countries. From 1820 to 1932, 250,000 Germans immigrated to Brazil, and they naturally brought lager yeasts to their adopted homelands. Southern Brazil has communities where nearly everyone speaks both Portuguese and German, while the world's second largest Oktoberfest celebration occurs in a city called Blumenau. The country's dominant breweries were founded during the 1880s, the Antarctica Brewery in Sao Paulo and the Brahma Brewery in Rio de Janeiro. For the next century, they were the two major rivals competing in the Brazilian beer market, a bit like Coke and Pepsi compete in the United States. The status quo was disturbed briefly in 1967 when another brand called Skol was introduced, and within a few years it became the number one brand in Brazil. But the business of Brazilian beer and world beer was about to change. In 1989, a group of three Brazilian investors led by Jorge Paulo Lemann, he's the one in the center, bought the Brahma Brewery in Rio de Janeiro, expanded its market share, and made it more profitable. Then in 1999, they took over their chief rival, Antarctica, and formed a new brewing consortium called the Beverage Company of the Americas, better known as AmBev. By then, Lehman was the richest man, not only in Brazil, but in all of South America. In 2004, AmBev of Brazil and Interbrew of Belgium merged, creating InBev. Then, in 2008, InBev engaged in a hostile takeover of the American brewing giant Anheuser Busch, brewers of the famous American brand Budweiser. The result of this merger was the creation of the world's largest brewing company, Anheuser-Busch InBev. Anheuser-Busch InBev is the product of this merger between AmBev and Interbrew, right? AmBev of Brazil, Interbrew of Belgium, and their acquisition of American giant Anheuser-Busch in 2008. This multinational corporation is headquartered in Belgium and produces over 600 beer brands in 150 countries. Most of what the company produces is light lager. It is the largest beer brewing company in the world, and most of its CEOs have been Brazilians. Anheuser-Busch InBev illustrates the global consolidation of the beer brewing business. While drinking beer from a family-owned brewery was once the norm, it is no longer. Most drinkers consume beers manufactured by publicly traded companies headquartered outside of their own country. Now, before I end this lecture, I want to talk about two more countries with interesting beer histories, South Africa and China. South Africa is not necessarily a country that would seem to be the likely location for a gigantic brewing conglomerate to develop, but it was. South African Breweries was founded in Johannesburg in 1895 to meet growing demand for beer in that large city. But the imposition of racial separateness or apartheid in South Africa beginning in 1948 limited the domestic beer market in that country because apartheid laws included a prohibition on the sale of alcoholic beverages for the indigenous black population. As a result, South African breweries initiated a massive expansion program outside of the country. Saab started breweries in nearby Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, and Angola. Then, after the Cold War ended, Saab acquired a variety of European breweries. The company's most significant acquisition, however, came in 2002 when it bought the Miller Brewing Company for $3.6 billion. The new firm, South African Breweries Miller, or Saab Miller, was at that time the world's second largest brewing concern. During the first decade of the 21st century, Saab Miller focused on expansion in China, India, and Vietnam. Then in November 2016, Anheuser-Busch InBev, the world's largest brewing concern, acquired Saab Miller. Poof! Massive multinational brewery merged into another massive multinational brewery. In the early 21st century, China's economy expanded at a truly stunning pace, and millions of people entered the middle class with enough money in their pockets to drink beer regularly. Snow beer is a light lager brewed in Shenyang, northern China. It is now the best-selling beer brand in the world. It's bigger than Heineken, bigger than Budweiser, and it's sold and drunk almost exclusively in China. So what's the history? Well, the Japanese built breweries in Manchuria during their occupation of the country in the 1930s, and those factories would eventually produce snow beer after World War II. During the 1990s and early 21st century, snow breweries received outside technical assistance from Saab Miller. Today, the Snow Breweries is a commercial enterprise with state support, and Snow Breweries is the world's third largest brewery by volume. Snow beer illustrates both the rapid, stunning expansion of China's economy at the end of the 20th century and the global preference for light lager. Beer is both global and homogeneous. People everywhere drink light lagers and consume beers controlled by multinational beverage companies. We've seen how Heineken taught the world to drink lager, and we've seen the biggest breweries consolidate. In the next lecture, I'll talk about the expansion of craft breweries, small microbreweries in the 21st century, as something of a counterbalance to the dominance of corporate brew. Here are the sources I consulted for this lecture. I look forward to your comments and questions.